And I am again very excited to have the honor to introduce our next keynote, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg serves as the 19th Secretary of Transportation of the United States. Since assuming this position in 2021, Secretary Buttigieg has sought to deliver the world's leading transportation system for the American people and economy. In his first year at the department, Secretary Buttigieg supported the development and passage of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, which will enable the most significant improvements in U.S. transportation infrastructure in over half a century. Since the law's passage, Secretary Buttigieg and his team have focused on effectively delivering the investments provided by this legislation. Supporting American supply chains dealing with shockwaves from the pandemic, including measures to address container congestion at America's largest ports, have also been key priorities for the Secretary. In addition, he has advanced major initiatives related to a comprehensive national roadway safety strategy to reduce deaths and serious injuries, delivery of emergency COVID-19 relief funds to transit agencies across the country, and awarded over $9.5 billion in discretionary funding to enhance transportation through over 800 projects in America. Secretary Buttigieg is also a member of the Competition Council, which was just mentioned and discussed at length in a good way. And under his leadership, the Department of Transportation has exercised its merger review authority for the first time to block JetBlue's proposed acquisition of Spirit Airways. We love that exercising of authority. That was good. And to promote competition in the airline industry, which we need a lot more of as well. Secretary Buttigieg has successfully pushed airlines to guarantee more amenities to stranded passengers and has taken a strong stand against family seating junk fees. Before leading the Department of Transportation, Secretary Buttigieg served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown in South Bend, Indiana, go Midwest, where he worked across the aisle to transform the city's future and received national recognition for his work on transportation issues. Secretary Buttigieg also served for 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. I am very, very honored and pleased to welcome our last and our final closing keynote, Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Morgan, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak in the coveted pre-happy hour slot. I will try to make the most of our time together, but I really appreciate being at a very timely gathering in this anti-monopoly summit. And so I want to recognize everyone here, the different backgrounds that you come from, the work that we share to make sure this is an American economy that works for everyone and not just a few. Or as the president would say, for an economy that grows from the bottom up and the middle out and not the top down. This is so important. I actually wrote down everything I want to say. So bear with me as I walk through and take advantage of this opportunity to share what is at stake for transportation when it comes to competition in the American economy. The lessons of experience, distant and recent, remind us of the costs of waning competition and mounting concentration in any industry. As we know, worker pay suffers, prices go up every part of a person's life, from everyday basics like home internet service and grocery shopping to life-altering domains like job searches and healthcare options get worse. And you've been hearing, I know, from a number of my colleagues over the course of the day on issues from junk credit card fees to over-the-counter hearing aids to unfair non-compete contracts. And so I'm glad to be able to round that out with some thoughts on how concentration is affecting the transportation sector and what we're doing about it. As President Biden so often says, and I'm sure you've heard this refrain today from my colleagues, capitalism without competition is exploitation. Any market society, any capitalist system depends on good government to ensure the conditions that make it competitive and not exploitative. And when we get it right, the result includes a private sector doing what the private sector does best, efficiently providing goods and services on competitive terms that empower consumers and workers, but only if we get it right. For the system to work, the public role has to work. The public roles of which there are many. The public role addressing market gaps with things like basic research. The public role in regulating and enforcing safety standards. The public role in providing public goods like the air traffic control system. And certainly the public role in ensuring adequate competition, which is as important in transportation as in any other sector, and in some ways even more so. And yet, for as long as I've been alive, in almost every mode of transportation, the tendency has been toward less competition and more concentration. A little over a decade ago, the three leading ocean shipping alliances accounted for a little over 30% of global container shipping. Today, they control 80%. 4 to 5 years ago, there were 55 major railroads. Today, there are 6, of which 4 account for as much as 90% of the market. At the time of airline deregulation, many respected voices confidently predicted a future in which there would be dozens of more or less evenly matched airlines in the U.S. domestic market. Today, of course, as we all know, the reality is that 4 dominant carriers account for 2/3 of market share. That kind of concentration means that the biggest companies don't have to compete as hard for workers or for customers, while the smaller players get crowded out and new entrants find it difficult to penetrate at all. And even leaving aside economic theory and just thinking of it in terms of common sense, it seems to me not credible to suppose that today's exceptionally high levels of frustration among passengers and workers, that all of that dissatisfaction could somehow be completely unrelated to the exceptionally high levels of market concentration that we're seeing in our time. Nor is it reassuring in the context of that dissatisfaction to see how many firms in these industries have tended to invest less in the resilience of their own systems and people than in stock buybacks and dividends and bonuses for executives. So for workers and for customers alike, there's clearly a lot in the transportation system that needs to change. You can ask anyone in a rural area where there's no real competition for a certain airline route, paying outrageous ticket prices if they can get service at all. You can ask an American small business owner who needs to order something from across the Pacific and experienced during the pandemic the sticker shock of watching the global alliances that control international shipping raise their rates by 1,000%. You can ask anyone who relies on an Amtrak route that is on time less than half of the time, not because Amtrak did anything wrong, but because the freight railroad that hosts them got in the way, even though that freight railroad is required by law to prioritize passenger trains. Or you could talk to anyone who wound up stranded at an airport for their Christmas vacation because an airline ignored years of warnings from its own workers about failing to invest in better systems, and that if they continued to fail to do so, there would be a logistical disaster. So in short, we shouldn't be surprised to see the emergence of monopolies and duopolies and oligopolies in this space correlate with the widespread frustration among consumers and workers who deal with them. So what are we doing? We're acting on 2 levels. We're dealing with the symptoms, as we have long been doing, and increasingly we are paying attention to the underlying causes. I'll start with the symptoms. The symptoms, anytime you have markets that aren't properly functioning or adequately competitive, are happening across every mode, so we're acting across every mode in this administration. The president signed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, giving American companies leverage against these international cartels. We're glad to see Pacific shipping rates have fallen about 80% from their extreme peak, but clearly there remain major concerns in the sector, so it's a good thing that that law gives government more tools to promote competition and strengthen the supply chain. We're taking a lot of action on trucking. In the spirit of intellectual honesty, let me concede that trucking is actually one of the few transportation sectors that is more fragmented than concentrated. But for different reasons, it too is far from being a textbook, healthy, competitive market. So we're addressing problems and abuses in the sector. We've ramped up enforcement against moving company scams with Operation Protect Your Move, which is a nationwide sweep against fraudsters that hold people's possessions hostage. And we've worked to improve wages and working conditions for drivers and to ensure new truckers and owner-operators aren't put at an unfair disadvantage or trapped in a predatory leasing arrangement. When it comes to rail, again, we support Amtrak, and we have stepped up safety audits and enforcement actions and rulemakings before and after the Norfolk Southern disaster in East Palestine. And right now, we are pushing for the Railway Safety Act, which I just learned today is set for markup in the Senate Commerce Committee next Wednesday, and which would empower us to go much further to strengthen safety practices and accountability. I'll give you one example of that. Today, by law, the maximum fine that our department is able to impose, even for a violation causing a crash that involves hazardous materials and gets somebody killed, is about $225,000. That is not enough to change the behavior of an operating company, a company with an operating income in the billions. This legislation would do something about that, among many other measures. I also want to add that even though it hasn't got as much coverage as I think it should, after being very clear about our view that railroads should negotiate with their unions and provide sick leave, we've seen many of them respond and begin to do the right thing over recent months. Union by union, including TCU, BRC, IAM, and company by company, including Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and recently Norfolk Southern, we've seen announcements of new sick leave agreements that are on the cusp of meaning that a majority of U.S. union rail workers will have sick leave. Of course, we won't stop until that figure gets to 100%, and we continue our push economy-wide so that every worker in every sector has paid leave. When it comes to airlines, we are leaning into our authorities as a regulator to hold companies accountable for outcomes. We've stepped up enforcement, we've promoted transparency, we've developed new regulations, we've added staff capacity, and we have secured enforceable commitments to provide better customer service. This time a year ago, hardly any of the 10 major airlines guaranteed in writing things like free rebooking, hotels, meal vouchers when they caused a delay or cancellation. Today, almost all of them do under enforceable commitments that we secured after making clear to them that we were about to publicize their willingness or failure to do so with our airline consumer protection dashboard. More recently, we're pushing them to guarantee that parents can sit with their kids on flights at no extra cost because it's obviously the right thing to do. Some, but not all, have answered our call to do that. You can check which ones on the dashboard. But I also want you to know we're not just asking for this. We are working on a common sense rule to ban these kinds of junk fees for good. Obviously, our work is far from done, and many of my friends in this community will remind me about the work yet to do, which we appreciate and respect. But I would argue we've covered a large amount of ground in 2 years, and I just want to make plain that my intention is to ensure that by the end of this term, we will be able to say that this administration has brought in the biggest expansion in transportation consumer protection enforcement and passenger rights since deregulation itself. That is our goal. But that's talking about symptoms. When the structure of an industry itself, whether by design or by evolution, brings less consumer choice, worse service, diminished accountability, and disempowered workers, you get to a point where addressing the symptoms won't be enough. We have to face root causes, and that, of course, is where the anti-monopoly movement comes in. And we think it's where DOT's competition authorities come in. Now, recently, some have expressed surprise at the discovery that DOT had competition authorities at all, but we definitely do. Deregulation removed many rules governing pricing, service, business practices, but it reaffirmed at the same time requirements around competition and fairness. Observers of our department have long suggested that our department do more to take these tools, pick them up, and put them to use. And I agree. Wherever the circumstances meet with our responsibilities and our authorities, we're going to act to ensure a more competitive transportation sector. And since the law gives us particular responsibilities and authorities with aviation, we're going to be especially attentive in the aviation sector. And that spirit of responsibility is what is guiding us in our support for the Justice Department's lawsuit against the proposed JetBlue Spirit merger. And in our decision to conduct our own investigation. Some commentators have objected to our involvement here, saying it is a break from years or even decades in which we tended not to pick up those tools as a department. And to those who view this as a change from years or even decades of practice, I want to make clear, I know. But we think it's the right thing to do. I think these times call for us to make sure that we're doing what both the law requires of us and what the moment requires of us. And if we want to make sure that competition in the airline sector and in transportation writ large gets better and not worse, we have to act accordingly, or we will always be left chasing symptoms. Now, one critical tool at our disposal to hold the aviation industry accountable is our authority to enforce against unfair methods of competition. We can use this authority to combat anti-competitive practices that fall outside of antitrust laws, and do so at their incipiency before the negative impact ripples across the market. Anti-competitive tactics deny consumers, workers, and small businesses the chance to make their own decisions. And they skew a market system that is supposed to incentivize honest competition within markets to provide the best service at the best value, not clever manipulation of the dimensions of the market itself. So, we are reinvigorating our use of these authorities to curb illegal tactics that undermine the free market and hurt consumers and workers. And because access is often a barrier to competition, we're also looking at ways to open up opportunities for new and smaller businesses to compete in the transportation space, which is more important than ever now that we're in the middle of a generational effort to rebuild our infrastructure. For example, we're working to build out that national network of electric vehicle chargers. As part of that effort, we put universal standards in place to make sure that the charging network, at least to the extent that it's being supported with taxpayer dollars, is interoperable between different charging companies. No walled gardens. The point being that no firm ought to be able to unfairly exploit its size or its position or exclude competitors from the opportunities of the future. I also want us to make sure that our own processes and tools don't become part of the problem. So right now, we are taking a hard look at how some infrastructure gatekeepers may try to use standard setting or the regulatory process to cut off and shut down disruption or competition from smaller and sometimes more innovative companies. The reality is that as industries become more concentrated, they lose the incentive to treat their employees fairly and deliver the best possible value. So while we're working to make our markets more competitive, we're also making efforts to reward those companies that put consumers and workers first and impose real consequences for companies that would rather drag everyone into a race to the bottom. And of course, in this work, as you've seen throughout the day, I hope, we are not doing anything alone. We are working on the President's Competition Council alongside colleagues like DOJ to address anti-competitive conduct, like CFPB teaming up to get rid of junk fees, like the Federal Maritime Commission improving ocean shipping, and the Surface Transportation Board holding railroads accountable. This is about ensuring that the future is better than the present by learning the lessons of the past. In some ways, it's a matter of restoring what we already know can work. And in other ways, it is about renewing and refreshing our regulatory frameworks and practices, some of which are as old as those bridges and tunnels that we're fixing, so that they can match the scale of the challenges in front of us as we approach this second quarter of the 21st century. Just as we are rebuilding physical infrastructure that has needed work for decades, acting to update, modernize, add, and in some cases replace the infrastructure we've been relying on, we also need to restore a competitive landscape that has been corroded by decades of permissive and deregulatory policy, frustrating workers and consumers alike in an era of consolidation and cost cutting. And across it all, the most important thing will be to remember that our market system exists in order to support everyday American life, not the other way around. So, as workers, consumers, business owners, citizens, every American who encounters any part of our transportation system, as we all do in countless overlapping ways every single day, deserves a government that will ensure they are served by a fair market, as well as a government that will look out for their physical safety. I know that is the expectation of the anti-monopoly community gathering here. I believe it is the expectation of the public, and I am certain it is the expectation of the president. And it is what we will continue to work on delivering every day. And I know that your role will continue to be essential in holding us accountable and in providing the kind of intellectual and public groundwork to make all of this possible and successful. Thanks again for the chance to join you today. Look forward to continuing to work together. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm actually the person standing between you and happy hour, and I'll try to move very quickly. My name is Faz Shakir. I'm honored to lead this organization. I want to thank Secretary Buttigieg once again, not only for accepting the invitation, but for coming and sharing some important thoughts about how change happens. We at the American Economic Liberties Project understand that for government leaders like Secretary Buttigieg and others, that as much as they're focused on trying to change things for the outside world, they're fighting a simultaneous fight inside, internally, to reorganize. I mean, he says, Secretary Buttigieg hint at, or say it explicitly, that he's changing minds even within his own agency of people reconceiving of what their authorities were from decades of people perhaps doing it the wrong way. And those are challenges in themselves, and that's why we wanted to invite him here, give him the opportunity to lay out vision and bulldoze, and not only orient internally, but orient externally. And that's part of our obvious role here, is to create this anti-monopoly movement. While I was doing thank yous, not only to Secretary Buttigieg, I want to thank the people who made this conference happen. These things are very hard to pull off.